I'm Emily from Homemade Emily Jane. Today I want to teach you some of my tips and tricks for making perfect half square triangles using a die cut machine. The reason I love this method is because I don't have to trim off any dog ears at the end, so it kind of skips a step later on. It saves a lot of time and definitely saves my wrist with all that rotary cutting. Before we get started cutting, if you are new to AccuQuilt or you're not familiar with how die cut machines work, be sure to check out my previous video that is all about how to get started using an AccuQuilt. It talks about all of the basics that you need to know. I also invite you to subscribe to my YouTube channel because this is where I'll post lots more quilting tips and tricks as we continue our creative journeys together. Now let's get started with actually cutting out the fabrics using our AccuQuilt cutting machine. Before I get started cutting, I always like to prep my fabrics. So I picked out two different colors that I'm going to use for my half square triangles today. And I will lay them out flat. That beep was just my iron telling me that it is ready to go, which is great. So once your fat quarter is out flat, you can go ahead and press it, but I like to use some Best Press. You can also use any of whatever your favorite sewing spray starch is, or homemade starch if you like that as well. So I just give my fabric a nice mist. And then to make sure that it really sinks in, I just rub the fabric together. And then take my iron, and the iron will get out all the wrinkles and also dry the starch. I like to prep my fabric like this regardless of what I'm cutting or how I'm cutting it, but I find it really important if you're cutting on the bias, like we're doing with half square triangles. So you want your fabric to stay as crisp as possible, and that's where the starch really comes in handy. So I will go ahead and do the same thing with my other piece of fabric as well. Once your fabrics are pressed nice and flat, grab your cutting machine and your dies and meet me over at your cutting station. Before we actually get started cutting with the AccuQuilt, I am going to choose to cut into rough cut strips, which is not a requirement, but to me it just is helpful. So I take the die that I'm working with today is the half square triangle 3-inch finished die, and from one edge of the blades to the other edge of the blades is about 3.5 inches. So I'm going to rough cut my strips at 4 inches so I have some wiggle room on both sides. So of course this does not have to be precise by any means. One thing I'll do, I normally do this, I'll place my two fabrics that I'm going to be sewing together right sides together, so that when they come out of the machine they will be cut and already positioned for me. Which decreases the risk of me stretching them or pulling them, trying to line them up. So they'll already be lined up together. And so now I will just go ahead and cut a strip that's roughly 4 inches wide. Of course, the whole point of using an AccuQuilt is that it doesn't have to be perfect when we do it with the rotary cutter, because the machine will do all of the precise work for us. So now I have my strip cut, they're already right sides together, and then because I have plenty of fabric here, I'm going to fold my fabric in half. So now I have 4 layers of fabric that are going to go through the machine at one time. Now we will line up our fabric with the edge of the blades on the die, so it's going at a slight diagonal across the die itself. And then go ahead and place the mat on top, and then just run it through the AccuQuilt machine. And then once it's through, we slide the mat off and we can pull off our perfectly cut triangles. They'll already be placed right sides together for us, so for now I'll just go ahead and make a little stack. Now, cutting out fabrics using AccuQuilt ensures precise cutting, but not necessarily precise piecing. So here, if we want to avoid trimming later, we want to be extra careful to be as precise as possible with our sewing. In order to do that, I have a few tricks up my sleeve. First, I'm using a 1/4 inch presser foot on my sewing machine, which helps a lot because it has a little line right where the 1/4 inch mark is. I also use a nice sharp needle to make sure that we don't have any issues with a dull needle. And then your machine might have 2 separate sewing machine plates, and I always like to use the one for the straight stitch plate, so it has a much smaller hole that the needle goes through. If you use the big hole, it's possible for your fabric to kind of get bunched up in there and your sewing machine can eat the corners of your triangle, and we don't want that. So I'm going to go ahead and use the small hole, the straight stitch plate. And I think we're ready to get started. My next tip I want to share with you is the benefit of using leaders and enders. These are just little scraps of fabric that you sew on before and after your seams to make sure that this catches any nasty nests and they don't end up on your actual triangles. So here we go. We'll start by just stitching on the leader. Once it gets to the end, I'll go ahead and put my needle down position. On this machine, it puts the needle down, but the foot comes up just a tiny bit so I can slide fabric underneath it. And then I'm also going to shorten my stitch length to 2. This machine's automatic is set to 2.5, which is fine too, but I find a slightly shorter stitch length that helps. So now I'll just grab the top 2 off my stack. As we cut them, they're already perfectly aligned and right sides together. And I'm going to stitch a 1/4 inch from the edge, which will be from the tip of the corner to the other tip of the corner. And one more tip to share, I forget about this one. On my sewing machine, I have diagonal seam tape from Cluck Cluck Sew, and I'll go ahead and put a link in the description below so you can get some yourself. And it's just tape that has a perfect marking of a 1/4 inch. So now I have that to line up and the marking on my foot as well to make sure that I'm at a 1/4 inch and very straight. And then I'll just go ahead and sew straight along the line. And now, because I have a whole stack to work through, I'll go ahead and sew them all. Once you finish sewing through all your triangles, you can go ahead and stitch on your ender at the end. And now you have all your triangles chain sewed together, so you just snip in between each one. Once your triangles are all sewn, it's time to press them. This is another step that we want to be very careful on, as to not distort the triangles or to stretch them on their bias. So I will use a hot iron, and I also use a wool pressing mat here as well. And I'll begin with keeping the triangle closed and press it just to set the seam. And then I will finger press just very carefully, being really careful not to stretch it, and just open it up. You can press the seam open or to the side. I'm pressing these to the side. And then just take your iron very carefully along that seam. I'll hold it there for a few seconds, and then your half square triangle is done, and you don't have to trim off any dog ears. If you want to make sure that your half square triangles are super precise, you can take a ruler out and check the diagonal and trim it if needed. I personally just skip this step altogether and sew them together as is. They might not be as 100% perfect as if you were to square them up, like when you use some of the other methods of making half square triangles, but to me, this is just perfect. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you learned something new about making half square triangles. If you are curious about some other ways that you can make half square triangles, go ahead and check out the description below, because I will link some of my other blog posts for you. Be sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel to get updates whenever I post a new video, and also check out homemadeemilyjane.com for lots more quilting tips and tricks and AccuQuilt tutorials. Thank you!